Life, with all its joys and triumphs, its pains and sorrows, its challenges, its opportunities, its wonders and its dreams, began here. Here, in the rich red soil of a land where millions of years ago something stirred, a fusion of energies, a spark of creation, a confluence of possibilities as infinite as the stars. Here, on the tip of the African continent, were sown seeds of an ancient human impulse to trade, to barter, to craft things of value from the abundance of the earth. The spirit of enterprise and industry, the spirit that builds nations, was born here. As the people of this place strode forth, as far back as 1,000 years ago, to forge bonds of business with traders from China and India. Today, many generations later, nothing has changed. Except the world is coming to us. Not just because of where we are, here at the gateway to Africa, at the midpoint between East and West, but because of what we do. Here, the restless spirit that unleashed the fire of gold from deep in the earth has given us oil from coal, fuel from plants, new and powerful technologies to change the way we live, to fight disease, to take us to the stars. For this nation was founded on the premise that no obstacle is too great to be conquered, no divide too great to be bridged. This nation was forged from the alchemy of opposing energies, sparking in each other the birth of new ideas, new opportunities, new ways of getting things done. Today, we are applying these energies, these principles, these ways of working to the world of business and industry, here in the land where trade began. There's a movement here you cannot ignore. A restless spirit, a defiant resolve, a relentless determination to smash the obstacles in our path, to conquer the forces of doubt. We will take our place among the great nations of the world. Here life is invention. Life is transformation. Life is standing up, forging ahead, finding a way to make things work. Come, work with us. Build with us, break ground with us, here in the land that is alive with possibility, here in the land where your tomorrow can begin.
Please welcome broadcaster and founder, Tumi and Company, Tumi Makgabo.
Okay, it seems that there are a lot of people who haven't quite recovered from last night yet. But that's okay. We're sure that they'll join us as the conversation progresses. Good morning, everybody. It's really good fun to be with you. And joining me here, before we do anything further, I'd like to introduce the panelists. And yes, it is noted that I'm the only woman on the stage at the moment. Koos Bekker, the Chief Executive Officer of Naspers. Jonathan Oppenheimer, Executive Director of De Beers Group, Iqbal Sharma, the Deputy Director General and CEO of the Department of Trade and Industry here in South Africa, and Lorenzo Simonelli, the Chief Executive Officer of GE Transportation of General Electric Company. Gentlemen, to all of you, a very good morning. Thanks for joining me up here. And before we start the conversation, just a couple of rules. We want to really have this session be interactive. So we're going to have literally a couple of questions to the panelists, and then I'll open the conversation to the floor. However, in order for you to participate in this particular exercise, it's important that, one, you keep your questions brief. I know that there's a tendency for some people when they get the microphone to tell us their whole life history. We are interested, but perhaps outside, not in this particular session. That's the first thing. The second thing is please make sure that you identify yourself, and when possible, when you're asking your question, direct it at someone so we know exactly who you're speaking to. We don't have a lot of time, so we want to try to make it as quick and efficient, effective as we possibly can. So you saw the little clip, which, it's one of those moments or stories that always gives you a little bit of goosebumps. And being South African myself, I always love to hear about how, not only we've evolved, but the fact that in spite of a lot of the challenges we've had over the centuries and the millennia, that we're still here. And in fact, we're doing better, particularly in light of the economic crisis, than many other people are doing in the world. So let's not forget that. Now, gentlemen, if I could then come to you first. Lorenzo, I'm going to start with you at the far end, purely because you're sitting at the far end. Let's have a little bit of a conversation about the reality on the ground. We appreciate that there have been a lot of challenges in Africa. One of the issues I perhaps have sometimes is the fact that when we talk about the continent, we forget that it's a place that comprises more than 50 countries. And we draw parallels between Africa and China as if we're comparing two countries. Let's talk about the fact that we are made up of a multitude of different peoples, different cultures, different countries, laws, regulations, and so on, and how one can navigate that particular space to be successful, as many of you have.
I think, first of all, it's very fair to say, obviously, Africa is very different than China. When you look at General Electric and the strategy we have, number one, it's commitment for the long term. You have to be committed to a strategy of growth, and you can't look at it as being just 1 year, 2 years. You've really got to take a 20 to 30-year outlook when you're making your investment decisions. That's number one. The second one is understanding the country and the region itself. So you've got to have local presence, and you've got to have local relationship, local partners. And localization has to take place. So in the case of General Electric, it's the transferring of technology so as to enable the region itself to continue to develop. I think those are two of the main aspects. And thirdly, the transparency. You need to make sure that you're dealing in a transparent region, and from a government perspective, that there's very transparent relationships.
Iqbal, if I can come to you, some of the issues that Lorenzo's just touched on are very real in terms of people trying to do business on the ground in Africa. The transparency is an issue. Getting around is a big issue. Traveling, when you want to go to some of the countries in West Africa, you have to go via Europe. In order to get there, it adds a day to your journey, that costs money, et cetera, et cetera. Some of those real challenges, unpack a little from a regional context, being in the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa, and how you try to work within that context to encourage trade.
Look, I mean, the things that have been highlighted are very real challenges, but one has to look at it in the context of the space you're operating in. It's not a static view. If you take a look at Africa, say 30 years ago, there were not more than 2 democracies on the continent. 1991, there were 8 democracies. Today, there are 35 democracies. The trend line is moving in a particular direction. So once you have governance and rule of law in place, then comes in all the residual effects like infrastructure, all the logistics and things like that. Now, if you look at our region, just in Southern Africa, because of our varying colonial history and heritages, we have different infrastructure. So for example, you could take a train from one country in Southern Africa, but stop at the border on the other one because the rail gauge is different, because one was colonized by the British, the other colonized by the Germans. So how do you harmonize that? So one of the things that we are trying to do is harmonize the regional area, have common standards, common rules, tariffs, policies, and things like that. And that's where regional integration is going to come into play, because individually the countries are very small markets, but regionally we can present a significant market opportunity. And that's where I think the single biggest business opportunity arises, is in infrastructure, laying the foundation. There's no point in bringing products that you want to sell if there's no infrastructure in which place it and sell it.
That particular comment and statement is nothing new. We've heard that before, how we need to have integration and everybody needs to work together. It seems, however, sometimes that there isn't a political will or a will to make that actually happen, to translate from a conversation into reality. What about making that transition?
Look, I think it's happening, but how long is a piece of string? How do you judge the success of something like this? Regional integration efforts in Southern Africa are a fairly new concept for us. Only in 1994 did South Africa become independent. We started these processes. So we've been at it for maybe a decade or so. But if you look at the European Union, they've been at it for over 50 years and they're still not getting it right. So this is not something that can be fixed overnight. It's a very complex and very challenging for people to give up political sovereignty, to give up sovereignty in certain issues of policy making. But we're together, we're working on it, and we're in the right direction. But regional integration is a very complex process.
Jonathan, I know that you do a lot of work, not just in terms of mining. Everybody wants to come to you to solve the world's problems because of what you do. But let's try to drill down a little bit and look more realistically about the perceptual issues that we have on the continent. There are many people who look and say it's the dark continent, forget it, don't even bother and waste your time. However, there is very much this issue of the double standard. What people say versus what people do and therefore expect others to do. And I think on this continent, we suffer a great deal from that.
Yeah, Tumi, you're absolutely right. It's this is a 4-day conversation, not a 31-minute
Yeah, but you have to make it succinct. That's your challenge.
The reality of it is, yes, there is a disconnect in the language that's spoken, but there's a disconnect in most languages that are spoken. The real issue is to get beyond and understand some of the fundamental constraints that underpin a lot of the issues. And to my mind, one of the single biggest constraints we have in Africa is a lack of human capacity. Yes, the diaspora is coming home, and generally there is a net migration of diaspora back to Africa in general, and particularly to the more successful countries. That's a big plus, and they're bringing the skills. But we have very young societies. We have weak leadership or nascent leadership in our communities, in our societies, in our political structures, and in our business. And trying to run a business without a stable political environment, as Iqbal was saying, or a stable society is nearly impossible. So that happens. And in that lies one of the great challenges, because if you want to do business in Africa, you actually have to support the political and the society establishments and help them grow as well. And that leads on to some of these gaps, because you start talking a different language. In the West, we're incredibly comfortable with the idea of separation of powers, and most particularly the separation of business and government. In Africa, that's a much, much more difficult concept. Yes, we would like that, but if there's no government, where does business stop? And if there's no local service delivery, where does the actor stop? And that story and that dialogue is something that's very difficult. And that creates a gap, which results in lack of investment. In addition to that, there's a need to build out a common understanding, because we are a continent which has had huge conflict emotionally and intellectually as well as physically. And we need to find the commonality, the partnership, the long-term vision, the vision for our continent, not for us, but our children and our children's children. And that whole idea is really, really important. If you can build, Lorenzo was talking about long-term, that long-term vision, you can then create sustainable business in Africa. And when you do that, the returns are great.
Yeah, 4-day conversation indeed, you're right.
Yeah, I tried.
You did work really well. Chris, if I could then, last but not least, come to you. The reality is that on this continent, it's not just, and if it's the same story, I think, on this point, in many countries. It's not just about what other people want to do for us, with us, but there's also sometimes a challenge about our self-belief and how we communicate, converse, and so on. When you are looking, in light of your career and what you've done through Naspers, when you're looking at the continent, how does one begin to address the issue of self-belief enough to the point that people can do it domestically, and that it isn't so important what the West wants to dictate all the time necessarily?
To me, I think it's a good point. We operate in 48 countries in Africa. We make money in virtually all of them, and we do our business honestly. We don't pay off anyone. I think the best thing you can do for our self-belief is to stop all foreign aid. Now, let me just tell you why. Firstly, foreign aid engenders corruption, because if the citizens pay money upwards, then they turn to the leader and they say, hey, you're spending my bucks, you better be responsible, don't steal the money. But when they get it from France, in a backroom deal between Mr. Chirac and the local leader, the local guy takes 10%, and no one says a word because, this is money for jam. And then France says, well, you can spend the money, but you have to spend it on French companies, and the French companies have consultants, and in the end, 10% ends on the ground. It's a total corruption racket. In fact, supported by the Western NGOs who make a living selling aid to Africa. But the second thing is it's so puny. All the foreign aid in the world, of all the countries together, is $120 billion. The world global trade is $12 trillion, so it's 1% of world trade. It's peanuts. So if you're going to be a prostitute, at least sell for a decent price. You're not going to sell for 1%. Let me give you an idea. The US aid to Africa is $7 billion, right? The US spent $180 billion so far on saving AIG, just to put it in perspective. Goldman Sachs doesn't get out of bed for $7 billion. That's the total contribution of the US to Africa. Now, what does it do? When we sit in trade negotiations, here's Michael Spicer, there's the Minister of Trade, Rob Davies. These guys have to face tough guys. There's not foreign affairs that sits on the other side when you negotiate with America. It's a tough bastard. And he wants the best for his country. And he says, I refuse to lower my farming subsidies in Europe or the US, and you Africans are not going to export into my country. And these guys can't fight the battle if they're on their knees. So you just try, I'm too old for it, but get down on your knees, hold out a begging bowl, and try to punch the other guy. It just doesn't work. You have no leverage because you've taken his money. And if you look at the success stories in the emerging market, China got no foreign aid. The West destroyed the Summer Palace in 1860, and then the Japanese raped Nanjing in 1937. China built itself. India built itself. Brazil, Russia, none of them, South Africa or Korea, none of them are foreign aid stories. They're self-help stories. And then the last thing, Tumi, your point. Business is driven by entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs are an odd lot. They are opinionated and very confident. So the people that built the Industrial Revolution in England were grease monkeys with confidence. We're going to use steam to pump that water from the mine. And the people that build China now, China Mobile, Haier, Huawei, those are very strong-willed entrepreneurs with self-confidence. And I think the foreign aid industry undermines the confidence of our African people. They believe we're basket cases, so we start doubting our own abilities. We need to say to them, don't give me your arms, your pittances. Treat us at the table like fair parties. Give us a seat at the IMF that reflects the size of Africa. Give us a seat on the UN Security Council. Cut your education, your agricultural subsidies, and treat us as equals. So in any case, I know that annoys a lot of people, but of course.
Why don't you just let us know what you think?
To add to that, if you think about it, who in this room in 1988 would have said South Africa would have a peaceful transition to democracy? Put up your hands. I got 1, 2. Okay. None. 98% felt that there was going to be a civil war. It was a homegrown solution. We did it internally. We're some of the smartest people you'll ever meet here in Africa. And we've found ways to work our solutions, our African solutions, through the most incredible situations. And we've done it well. The world seems pretty happy investing in China, yet it's kind of like a black box to many of the Western investors. Africa, too, is like a black box. We have to persuade the international community that we're a successful black box, and we need to get beyond the rhetoric of war and everything else that is so much the normal story for Africa.
I'd like to open up the floor for questions. We have 3 microphones, I believe, one in the center, one, where are they all? If microphones can just put up their hands. Okay, there, and there. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask right now? Are we going to have one of those audiences? You're going to let us have the whole 40 minutes to ourselves? Oh, okay. That was close.
My name is Randall Kempner, and I work at the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. I am one of the evil NGOs, but I might be slightly different because I'm an evil NGO that has members that support entrepreneurship in Africa. So I'm wondering if that's okay, and I can be saved. And if not, or even if so, how do you promote entrepreneurship in Africa? If that's part of the answer, there are lots of challenges that we see, and I'd be interested to know the ones that you see.
Have a go?
Well, I'm going...
I'd really like to have a go at that one.
Okay, you have a go, and then Iqbal, you need to have a go. All right, Jonathan, go ahead.
Really, really interesting and sort of somewhat tangential, but you'll understand my point. If you look at the regulatory environment in Africa, it is geared towards large formal companies. And the reality of those who operate in the informal sector, who are fundamentally the strongest entrepreneurs we have, is that they're ungoverned. And so one of the greatest things Africa can do to enable its entrepreneurial culture, and I've traveled extensively and I happen to believe, maybe somewhat biasedly, that Africa actually has the strongest entrepreneurial culture anywhere in the world that I've come across. We have to unpick what is a regulatory mountain that small informal businesses have to cross if they want to become scale. And we've done some really, really early work in the Brenthurst Foundation, a small organization we have up in Johannesburg, the family runs, which is looking at sustainable economic growth. And we believe that if you could unpick that regulatory mountain that you have to cross to go from informal to formal, you could add something like 0.5% to 1% to Africa's growth rate. Right there, you take our best entrepreneurs and you give them a roadmap to scale. Right now, they run into that mountain and they stop growing.
Look, I think it's much more complex.
Don't worry, that's a complex answer. Just simply put.
Yeah. I mean, when you want to promote enterprise, one is to have the enabling environment, to have a level playing field. And that's not the case in Africa. I mean, we can export all the cocoa we want out of Africa to Europe. The minute you want to move up the value chain and make it into chocolate, then you can't get it into European markets. So that's the first area we need to address. Once you have a level playing field, I mean, you just look at South Africa, the culture of enterprise. You saw, I mean, 1,200 years ago, this region was trading with India and China. So entrepreneurship is within the DNA of people. What happened, unfortunately, was colonialism that came in and upset that trail. For most of human history, India and China have been the world's largest economies. But now what we're seeing is, and I disagree with people who say that India and China are miracles and it's a new thing happening. No, this is a market correction. It's a return to a natural order. And Africa will also take its place. But you just have to go into the townships, you have to go into different parts of Africa to see enterprise and to see what people can do with the barest of resources, the most minimal of resources, things that we wouldn't even consider not having before we can do anything, people are making do with. So from our perspective, we want to create, as government, we create policies, regulations, and enabling environment to promote entrepreneurship. But then you need the private sector to come in. You need capital, access to finance. Then you need risk profile changing. So it's all kinds of other things that come into play before the entrepreneur can get on and play his game.
It's interesting that you talk about leveling the playing field, because I think we'd be remiss if we don't make this point, that on the continent, in South Africa perhaps is the exception to some extent to this particular rule, but the empowerment of women is crucial when it comes to ensuring that there is a level playing field. You have half of your population that is a potential resource that so many times is overlooked in terms of entrepreneurship support and so on. And I hope that as time moves on, it's something that is particularly pushed. Now, I know the DTI does a lot of work in terms of supporting women entrepreneurs in South Africa, but that is not something that we're seeing continentally. Okay, that was a statement, not a question. Anybody else want to ask a question on the floor? This gentleman right here in the front row, please raise your hand so she can spot you. Okay.
Hi, good morning. Edward Kisweda from Alexander Forbes. And I have to declare my interest before I raise my question, make my comment and raise my question. Up until 6 months ago, I was the Deputy Commissioner of South African Revenue Service. And to your point, Koos, about the pittance of aid money coming into Africa, the Tax Justice Network a few years ago did a study that says if tax leakage in Africa could be reversed through the aggressive tax practices by businesses, many of them African businesses, but also multinationals on the African continent, it would replace all the aid money by several multiples. Would some of the heavy businessmen on the stage like to comment on that?
I agree totally. By the way, for the foreigners, South Africa is one of the best revenue services anywhere in the world. We operate in 127 countries, and we pay these guys 2 billion rand every year. They are merciless, but they are so efficient. It's totally true. I mean, the amount of money that flowed into Nigerian government personal accounts offshore far exceeds the amount of aid that all of Africa receives. It's just a proportion. So take it in a different way. US trade with Africa is $77 billion about. US aid, as we discussed a minute ago, $6 to $7 billion is 1/10. So if we can sit with the Americans and say, stop your subsidies, your barriers, your indirect pushback when we try to sell you something, right? And we can improve our trade terms with the US by 10% as Africa as a whole. We've covered the whole aid budget. If we can improve it by 20%, we've doubled it. And we sit at the table as equals. The biggest problem with aid is it reduces you to the relationship of a giver and a recipient. You know, it's the kind old lady with the dripping diamonds, excuse me, that sort of deigns to hand you this little pittance that keeps you alive because you're a weakling, either you're stupid or you drink or something. And colonialism left a scar. We saw it in India that the greatest, we do business in India, it's a marvelous country. The greatest thing is the Indians are rising up against the empire. So just to give you an idea, cricket started in England. It's the epitome of Eton, Oxford, Coldstream Guards, sort of life these guys lead. Today, in economic terms, there's Imtiaz Patel, head of Supersport, he'll tell you, 50% of world revenues in cricket comes from India. Sorry, 70%, where last I looked it was 50, it's now 70%. Isn't it marvelous that the colonials have turned to the empire, and the Indians are somewhat disdainful of the British now. They say, this country is a basket case, you know, how will it ever recover? And that's what we need to do in Africa, is to gain confidence, to be able to look at these givers and just say, guys, if you sit as an equal with me at the table, I'm prepared to deal with you in a nice, polite way. But just don't give me your money. I don't want to be bribed. I don't want to be patronized, you know?
I think there's a lot of discussion around the giving of aid. I think to just put a different profile, there's a lot that South Africa and the region can do also, open itself up to business. Because if you actually look at aid, it's a minimal contribution. What could be much further is by taking the large multinationals, clearing up some of the bureaucracy for doing business within the region, clearing up some of the transparency, and having an open platform. You've got a lot of companies that aren't necessarily the size of General Electric that struggle being able to break through that. And so there's got to be an actual path for business to be open and clear. That can be a huge revenue generation, also for the tax authorities. We don't talk much about, okay, how do you make people want to invest in the region? And that's got to be one of the big topics for the next few years.
Let me jump onto that one. I'll have a moment. I'm going to be opportunistic. Yeah, you can start with us, with the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa. South Africa's position as a gateway into the continent. All these issues that you're talking about, reducing red tape, making it easier for companies to set up, those are all things that we strive to do. And we continually try to improve our efficiencies in terms of ease of doing business. But it's a changing environment, but you need to engage with the continent. And I have to take the occasion with this audience to talk about some of these points that the US is the largest investor in Africa, but 95% of the investment is in oil and gas, so it's not very visible. China's footprint is only 10% of the US presence in Africa, but yet it seems as if China's everywhere because they've diversified. They're into telecoms, into manufacturing, into services, and a range of areas. And I think the platform for engagement with the US, because largely US companies here, is the only platform for engagement is the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act, the AGOA. Now, if you talk to most people about AGOA, they think it's only about clothing and textile benefits. But in fact, AGOA has a range of benefits for US companies to be able to engage with the continent, with financial assistance and other kinds of non-financial assistance and things like that. But yet, we haven't even scratched the surface of maybe even 5% of AGOA's potential. And AGOA has been extended and extended, but the proponents only go for clothing and textiles, and that's a perception. But meanwhile, there's a range of efforts in infrastructure and other areas that one can come in. Now, you've heard it already from Mo Ibrahim and others that the return on investment in Africa is the highest in the world. IMF, World Bank, everybody says that. How do you get in? Where do you get in? Who do you partner with? You know, we have development finance institutions like the IDC, the Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa, large investor on the continent. Partner with them. We have Export Credit Insurance Corporation, which provides political and commercial risk cover to projects on the continent. Default rates are very low because returns on the continent are very high. The Gautrain metro rail project in Johannesburg is the world's largest greenfields rail concession under construction, anywhere in the world. And you're going to find some of these huge infrastructure projects globally are going to be based in Africa. So infrastructure, in telecoms, in bridges, roads, highways, these are the huge business opportunities right up your alley, right in your business. So come and engage with us. You cannot engage with Africa from the outside. Get in on the ground. We'll take you in a car. We'll go into the places. We'll go see the people and do the deal.
And we'll have a braai.
We'll have
Okay.
a braai.
There are a couple of other questions. Mike, can you hang on a second? I just want to take the gentleman at the back and then yourself. There's a gentleman right at the back row there, please.
Thank you, Tumi. My name is Hendrik de Tooy. I'm from Investec Asset Management. I think we're the biggest investors of other people's money across the African continent, and as excited as the panelists. But, and that's the question I want to throw back at the panelists and probably Iqbal to start with. Where are we on the regional plans? Because until you get, if Africa is not one country, it's many places, many regions, until you get 4 or so effective regions working with clear rules, with clear entry points, and with local capital markets, we're not going to get ahead, and we can talk all this good stuff. And I just wondered where we are in terms of not only NEPAD, but the post-NEPAD process. And then secondly, how do we get the leaders, the political leaders, to actually understand that their only job is the facilitation? Because that's an example of infrastructure. There are many infrastructure funds around the world. There's probably one big one or two, excluding one in South Africa, dealing with Africa. You know what? They can't get the money invested because it takes so long to negotiate a power project. Not least to mention South Africa, how long it's taken to negotiate something. So tell us where the regional agenda is, and how do you think we can get our politicians to get together and make sure that's their main agenda?
Well, it's great because not only do we have Iqbal, but we've got Rob Davies here. So I'm guessing between the two of you, you'll be able to tackle that question. Go first, Iqbal.
Well, I'm not going to tackle the second part of your question. But look, I mean, the regional agenda is critically important for us. South Africa as a market in itself is too small. We have the customs union, which is South Africa, Swaziland, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia. We have the SADC area. We have the East African, West African, all these regional groupings. And the idea is eventually to work towards a FTA on the continent that will cover from Cape to Cairo. You're looking at a market in excess of 700 billion people. That's an ambition. And one has to work towards that ambition. But along the way, the devil lies in the details. And when you're talking about, so many different countries with sovereignties and national interests of their own, it's a very complex process. But we are moving in that direction. Now, the first area is around trade rules, around tariffs, around standards, harmonizing standards and removing non-tariff barriers and technical barriers to trade, sanitary, phytosanitary, those kind of issues. That's the first stage. Then you move into sectoral issues. Now you're operating in the services sector. The services sector is a growth area, but before services, we see industrialization as a first growth area. So industrial capacity, manufacturing, and those type of things. And the dialogues are there. There are platforms where the financial services sector can make contributions in terms of their interest in the regions. And that's how we coordinate our policies. We do it in consultation with business and labor. As you know, in South Africa, we have a very consultative process. Business, labor come together, we put our issues down, and then we kind of work out solutions. But it's not going to happen overnight. Now, the financial services sector in South Africa and in the region does need reform significantly. There's just not enough competition. So we need to bring more competition in and make it easier, because financial services is going to unlock the capital flow. So work is going on in that area. And I think maybe you don't have the right understanding of the role of our political principles, because they are doing exactly what they're mandated to do, is to create the environment. But the environment is not created simply by signing an agreement and putting it on shelf. The environment is action. It's incentives and support at the micro level that can filter up.
Rob Davies, I'm inclined to have you add more to that, if you would, please, the Minister. The mic is right behind you.
No, I think the point is that we've put in place in SADC, at least, we've put in a framework of an FTA. So now we have removed duties on substantial trade within the SADC region. The point is, though, that has not really changed the patterns of trade. There are many other things. And so there's a built-in agenda of addressing trade facilitation issues, making border posts more functional, addressing all kinds of regulatory disparities and all of that. But then beyond that, then there's the question of infrastructure development, because many of the factors that impede inter-regional trade are actually underdeveloped production structures, inadequate infrastructure, and all of that. Our approach is we want to build this thing up bottom up. We don't want to kind of set some pie in the sky kind of institutional arrangement and just jump into that without all these other conditions being in place. That's our approach to South Africa. And I think that we want to encourage other stakeholders from business as well as labor, all other stakeholders, to become much more involved in the debates about regional integration. My sense is that it's far too much a little room of ministers sitting together with officials from secretariats and consultants from God knows where who are trying to shape all these plans and projects, and they're not enough driven by the real actors on the ground. So I would encourage people to become much more involved in the debates and discussions on these matters.
All right, Mr. Minister, thank you very much. Mike Spicer.
That's a perfect opening, because in fact both Hendrik and the Minister and Iqbal have stolen my lines. That was the issue I wanted to put on the table. And in fact, Minister Davies and I were talking at the previous session about the imperative need to create regional markets. And I think, to the point that the Minister's just indicated, there is now, I think, growing interest, and we need to expand it from our side in business to come to the table and be party of these discussions, because this is one of the key ways that we are going to unlock opportunity in Africa. If you permit me one other lighter note comment, the conversation about tax efficiencies and gathering, I think one of the standout statistics of the Euro troubles is the number of Greek taxpayers declaring an income over €1 million. You can count on two hands. And so when Cyril Ramaphosa, describing something that had gone pear-shaped, used the term going south, I said, no, Cyril, you have to adjust that. You have to talk about going north these days.
Thanks, Mike. We have literally a minute and a half left, which means time for one more question from the lady there, and unfortunately I will have to wrap it up. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Teresa Clark, the chairman of Africa.com. My question is for Jonathan Oppenheimer. You spoke about the divergence in thought between the West and Africa relative to the separation of government and business, and how in the West there's a very high comfort level with respect to that separation, and in certain regions in Africa there must be a greater connection between the two. My question for you is, given what has happened after the financial crisis in the West, where the Western governments have stepped in and become very active in taking over private sector, whether it's taking over General Motors or AIG or bailing out the financial services industry in the US, do you think that that change in paradigm helps to bridge the gap between the West's understanding of this issue and what actually occurs on the ground in Africa?
Teresa, very good question. Not right now is the answer that I would give off the cuff. I think 5-10 years from now, when that experience embeds itself within the business and the political communities in the West, it may. It's really a question for me of the time horizon of the return expectation. If, Lorenzo, you were talking 20 years, in the diamond mining business, it's 20 years to get your money back in nominal terms, let alone real terms, if you're making an investment into a major mine. If you are committed to 20, 40, 80 years in a particular location, then there is an absolute natural alignment between the local community and those who run that community, the political and the society elite, to partner with business on a sustainable basis. If you are thinking transactionally and that you're interested in making money in the moment and running away, then naturally that alignment doesn't exist. And the challenge is finding those partners who have that long-term vision and commitment at the front of their business plans. And that is, to my mind, the single largest exciting opportunity for those who really do have a long-term commitment. Africa is open for business. It takes a long time. You have to talk and make friends. And I'm always reminded of Kenneth Kaunda, who said to my grandfather one time over dinner, and he was saying, "Ah, yes, Harry, you're an African. You're not like those people there in the West." And my grandfather looked a little puzzled and said, "Mr. President, why is that?" And he said, "Ah, yes, you understand us here in Africa. Here we become friends first, and then we do business. Over there, they do business first, and then they become friends." And I think that's the answer of getting ahead in Africa. You have to make friends and trust people.
Well, I hope you won't be less friendly with me because I have to wrap it up. Jonathan, thank you very much. The sign says time is up, so our time is up. Koos, Bekker, Jonathan Oppenheimer, Iqbal, Sharma, and Lorenzo Simonelli. Gentlemen, to you, thank you very much, and thanks for your attention.
Thanks to me.